It's funny how things connect, sometimes in really unexpected ways. Today, we're doing a deep dive into a story that seems to link global shipping, big power politics, and, you won't believe this, maybe the legacy of a 96-year-old guy who started out making plastic flowers.
It is fascinating, isn't it? Right from the start, you see these threads pulling together a blocked port deal, U.S.-China friction, which is always there, let's be honest, and then Pakistan making some, well, interesting moves. It really shows you that intricate web of, global relations.
Exactly. So we're going to try and unpack China's recent move to block this really significant deal. It involves the Panama Canal, but also a whole network of ports around the world. And like you said, this isn't just some business thing happening in a vacuum.
Not at all. It's playing out against this whole backdrop of U.S.-China tensions, which seem to be ratcheting up again. And Pakistan's role in all this could actually be quite pivotal.
Right. And for this deep dive, we're working from transcripts of 3 GVS New W's YouTube videos. One called China Blocks Panama Canal Deal, Strategic Power Play or Self-Defense.
Okay.
Another is Pakistan Army playing double games with China and U.S. And third, Pakistan's NSA explains how they have fooled the world. So quite a mixed perspectives there.
Yeah, sounds like we've got some good material to work with, different angles on the situation.
So the mission today, for you listening, is to really get under the skin of these events. Why did China do this? How does it fit into the bigger U.S.-China picture? What's Pakistan's play here? We're hoping for those moments where it all sort of clicks.
The aha moments, yeah. Trying to see that bigger, maybe surprising picture behind the headlines.
Exactly. Okay, so let's start with the Panama Canal deal getting blocked. Now, one thing that might have grabbed people's attention, maybe set the stage a bit, was Donald Trump talking about reclaiming the Panama Canal.
Right, I remember that. What was the context there? Because the U.S. gave back control years ago, didn't they?
They did, end of 1999.
Yeah.
But clearly, the idea of American influence or maybe control over the canal still resonates with some. Trump actually said, I think it was in a congressional address, that his administration was reclaiming it. So that rhetoric was definitely out there around the time this big deal was being discussed.
Okay, so that's the backdrop. And the deal itself, it wasn't just about the canal zone ports, was it? It was much bigger.
Oh, much bigger. So you had a U.S. asset management firm, BlackRock, that's R-O-C-K-C-K, bit unusual spelling.
Okay, BlackRock.
They were leading a consortium, basically a group, to buy up port operations near the canal. The seller was C.K. Hutchinson Holdings, a huge conglomerate based in Hong Kong.
Right.
And this deal, it really had 2 massive parts. First, the big headline grabber, selling 90% stakes in 2 super strategic ports, Balboa, that's on the Pacific side, and Cristobal on the Atlantic entrance in the canal.
And those ports, they're absolutely vital, right, for trade.
Hugely vital. I mean, figures suggest they handle something like nearly 40% of all container traffic coming to or going from the U.S.
Wow, 40%.
And about 6% of total global trade passes through them. So yeah, any change in who runs them is a big deal.
Okay, so that's part one. What was the second part? You said it was even more extensive.
Yeah, arguably.
Yeah.
BlackRock was also going to get an 80% stake in C.K. Hutchinson's entire network of global port subsidiaries.
Whoa, and how big is that network?
We're talking 43 ports spread across 23 countries. Think Europe, Asia, Africa.
Major hubs.
Okay, but not including their home base ports.
Exactly. The deal specifically excluded ports in Hong Kong and mainland China itself. But still, a massive global footprint. And the total price tag for this whole thing.
This has been huge.
Close to 23 billion U.S. dollars.
23 billion. Okay. So a massive, globally significant transaction. And China just stopped it.
Pretty much. Just as it looked like it was going to be finalized, this was around April 2nd, the Chinese government stepped in, said they needed to review it.
And their official reason was, officially, it was about an antitrust review. Making sure it wouldn't hurt fair competition. But, I mean, let's be realistic. The real concerns bubbling underneath were almost certainly about national security and China's economic strategy.
Makes sense. The Panama Canal is just such a critical artery for world trade, and especially for China, right?
Absolutely critical. If you look at the numbers, something like 21% of all the freight going through that canal is either coming from or going to China. It's a vital link, particularly for their trade with Latin America.
So any hint of losing influence or access there, or seeing it fall under potentially U.S.-aligned control, would ring alarm bells in Beijing. Big time.
And the reaction inside China seems to have been pretty strong, too. That GVS report mentioned a newspaper article, Tom Powell, I think it was, with a headline that basically said, "Don't be naive and senile."
Wow, that's blunt.
Yeah, it really captures this feeling that maybe selling these assets was seen as, well, selling out China's interests.
And the article suggested the public mood was quite intense.
Very intense. You saw phrases like kneeling down to the U.S., spineless, even betraying the Chinese people. It shows just how deep the feeling runs on this.
So it's not just a government stance, there's a public element too.
Definitely. And a lot of that feeling apparently was directed towards the man behind C.K. Hutchinson, Li Ka-shing. He's 96 now, I think. Built this incredible empire.
Right. His story is something else, isn't it? Came to Hong Kong as a refugee, started with plastic flowers, and built this global giant. Tell us a bit more about C.K. Hutchinson itself.
Well, it's a massive multinational, genuinely one of the world's biggest port operators right now. They control something like 52 ports across 27 countries.
Wow.
And Li Ka-shing himself, yeah, amazing story. Fled the mainland during the war, started small in the 50s, and just built and built. Yeah. Shipping, telecoms, energy, retail. I mean, people might know brands like Superdrug in the UK or 3 Mobile, the perfume shop. It's incredibly diverse.
It really is a journey from, like you said, plastic flowers to running ports all over the world.
Quite something. But what makes this current situation even more layered is his relationship, or maybe lack of relationship, with the current political leadership in China.
Ah, okay. How so?
Well, he's always kind of kept his distance from direct politics, despite his business clout. And there have been reports, or at least suggestions, of past disagreements with President Xi, things around property deals, but also his decision, maybe a decade ago, to move a lot of his personal wealth out of China.
Oh, interesting. Where did he move it?
Vancouver, Canada, was mentioned specifically back in the early 2010s.
And moving assets out like that, especially with the way things have tightened up for some business figures in China recently, that looks pretty significant now, doesn't it?
It certainly adds a layer. And it means that while C.K. Hutchinson is still a big player in China, a much smaller slice of their total pie, maybe only 12% of revenue, actually comes from Hong Kong and mainland China now. His investments are heavily tilted towards the West.
So strong Western ties.
Very strong. Strong enough that there were even reports, again mentioned in the GVS piece, that the Chinese government told its state-owned companies to basically avoid doing new business with Li Ka-shing's firms.
Okay, so this is definitely not just a straightforward commercial deal being blocked on antitrust grounds. There's history, there's politics, there's strategy.
Exactly. It highlights that geopolitical dimension. China blocking this isn't just about Panama. It seems to be about stopping a company with these deep, long-standing Western links from controlling crucial trade infrastructure all over the globe.
Especially infrastructure that could be relevant to their own big strategic projects like the Belt and Road Initiative.
Right. That's China's huge plan to connect Asia with Africa and Europe, land routes, sea routes. Controlling key ports is fundamental to that. If ports along those routes end up under the management of a company seen as too close to the U.S. or the West,
that poses a risk to the whole project's security and success. Yeah, I can see that.
And the GVS report specifically mentioned concerns about ports in places like the Red Sea. That's the gateway to the Suez Canal, right? Which is how a massive chunk of China's exports get to Europe, maybe 60%.
And they're already dealing with the Houthi attacks, disrupting shipping there. So any further potential vulnerability, especially one linked to perceived U.S. influence, would be a major headache for Beijing.
Definitely. And then there's the Bab al-Mandab Strait, that other choke point at the southern end of the Red Sea. Huge amounts of Chinese trade pass through there too, hundreds of billions of dollars worth every year.
So control, or at least stable access through these points, is absolutely paramount for them.
Exactly. And then you bring Pakistan into it. Karachi Port is right next door, relatively speaking, to Gwadar Port,
which China has poured money into developing.
Precisely. Gwadar is seen as this key strategic asset for China, potentially bypassing the Malacca Straits, which they worry about. So the thought of a company with strong U.S. ties, managing ports, potentially even nearby, like Karachi.
Yeah, having the Americans or a company perceived as American-friendly right next door to your strategic investment, that would make them very uncomfortable.
So pulling it together, the insight isn't just China blocked a deal. It's that they likely saw this deal as a potential threat to their economic lifelines, their strategic projects like Belt and Road, and maybe even a way the U.S. could gain leverage over them.
It really shows how interconnected global trade infrastructure is with national security anxieties. Letting C.K. Hutchinson, given Li Ka-shing's history and the company's Western focus, manage these key locations was just, it seems, a risk Beijing wasn't prepared to take.
And all of this, as we said, is happening with U.S.-China tensions already pretty high. And you have that rhetoric from the U.S. side, like Trump's comments about wanting the Panama Canal back.
Right, which plays into this wider American concern about China's growing global footprint, its influence.
Even though technically Hutchinson Ports, a Hong Kong-based company, ultimately under Chinese sovereignty, has been running 2 of Panama's 5 ports since the handover in '99.
That's a good point. So a Chinese company, in a sense, has been there for over 2 decades. Maybe Trump's comments and the wider concern are less about that specific company and more about China's overall role in global logistics.
Could be. I mean, the whole COVID pandemic really threw that into sharp relief, didn't it?
Yeah.
Suddenly, everyone realized just how much the world relies on China for manufacturing, for shipping.
Yeah, those supply chain bottlenecks were a huge wake-up call for a lot of countries about vulnerabilities.
And Trump's response, or proposed response, included this big push to try and rebuild America's own shipbuilding industry.
Which is, let's say, a monumental task, given where things stand now.
It really is. He talked about big government investments in U.S. shipyards, but also, potentially, tariffs on ships built overseas, maybe 10%, maybe 30%.
And didn't he mention specific fees for Chinese ships?
Yeah, he specifically mentioned potentially hitting Chinese-flagged ships with an extra fee, like $1.5 million per ship coming into U.S. ports. That's on top of the tariffs already in place.
But the reality check here is, well, the U.S. shipbuilding industry has been declining for decades. The numbers are just stark.
What are they?
In 2023, I think the U.S. got something like 0.1% of global new shipbuilding orders by tonnage. China, they got 74%.
It's 74% versus 0.1%. Yeah,
Yep.
that's a huge gap. You can't just flip a switch and rebuild that capacity overnight.
Exactly. So the political goal might be there, but the industrial reality is very different. The immediate effect of those kinds of tariffs wouldn't be more U.S.-built ships, not in the short term anyway.
It would likely just mean higher costs for the shipping companies, who mostly use ships built in places like China and South Korea.
Which then get passed on to American consumers as higher prices for imported goods.
Right. So looking at the whole picture, maybe China blocking this port deal was partly defensive, safeguarding its routes.
But also maybe preemptive, taking a huge globally connected asset off the table that maybe President Xi felt could be used as leverage against China by the U.S. down the line.
That's an interesting thought. Okay, so that sets the scene for the China-U.S. dynamic around this. But now we need to bring in Pakistan, because that GVS deep dive report, the one suggesting Pakistan's playing double games, that adds a whole other layer of complexity.
It really does. And you start to see how these seemingly separate issues, the port deal, U.S.-China rivalry, might actually connect through Pakistan's strategic choices.
Right. So let's dig into that. This report, it makes a pretty explosive claim, doesn't it, about a secret deal for a Chinese military base at Gwadar.
Extremely explosive. A Chinese military base right there at Gwadar. Now, we absolutely have to stress both Beijing and Islamabad have firmly denied this, called it baseless speculation.
Okay, denials noted. But the report itself, it came from a publication called Dropsite, apparently founded by some ex-journalists from The Intercept.
Right.
And they claim to have confidential documents detailing this supposed agreement, covering late 2023 into 2024. So despite the denials, the idea itself is out there, and the implications, if it were true, are massive.
Absolutely massive, because Gwadar's location, I mean, it's just incredibly strategic. It sits right at the mouth of the Strait of Hormuz.
Overlooking all that oil traffic coming out of the Persian Gulf, key shipping lane.
Exactly. For China, putting a military base there would be a huge strategic win. The GVS report called it a potential strategic strong point.
Yeah, a key part of their push westward may be reducing how much they rely on getting through the South China Sea to reach the Indian Ocean.
And it's the endpoint of that land corridor they're building through Pakistan's CPAC. Gives them direct access to the Arabian Sea.
So huge advantages for China. But from the U.S. point of view,
it would be seen as a major challenge. A direct challenge to the U.S. strategic posture in the Persian Gulf region, and a big blow to their whole policy of trying to contain China's influence.
It basically gives China a way to potentially get around that Malacca Straits choke point, which the U.S. and its allies could theoretically control in a conflict. That's always been a worry for Beijing.
It almost seems hard to fathom, though. Why would Pakistan, which is facing a really severe economic crisis and historically has relied quite heavily on the U.S. and the West for money and military gear, why would they do something so provocative, something that directly undercuts U.S. interests?
That's a core question the report tries to grapple with. It suggests it all ties back to Pakistan's really complicated, sometimes strained relationships with both Washington and Beijing.
I mean, Pakistan was a key U.S. ally for decades, right?
Mm-hmm.
Cold War, war on terror.
Absolutely. But things have gotten rocky. The U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan caused friction. Some things former PM Imran Khan said didn't help relations. Ties definitely cooled off.
But weren't there efforts from the Pakistani military side to try and patch things up with the U.S. recently?
Yes, the report mentions that. The Army chief at the time, General Bajwa, visited the U.S., apparently made a point of saying they preferred American weapons, even joked about liking American sitcoms more than Chinese food.
What, really? Trying to charm them?
Seems like it. All apparently aimed at improving the relationship. And there was talk about Pakistan maybe warming up relations with India, too, which is something the U.S. really wants.
Right. The U.S. thinking is, if Pakistan and India aren't at loggerheads, India doesn't have to worry about a two-front war and can focus more on countering China. That's been a consistent U.S. goal.
But, according to this GVS report, despite those efforts from Pakistan, the really substantial, tangible support from Washington, maybe it didn't quite materialize in the way Pakistan hoped.
Okay. So maybe a sense of disappointment or unmet expectations on Pakistan's side regarding the U.S.
That seems to be the implication. And perhaps that disappointment, combined with other factors, contributed to a cooling of the relationship with China, too. Even though China has invested billions in CPEC, those projects have reportedly stalled or slowed down significantly.
And China wasn't happy about Pakistan seemingly cozying up to the U.S. either.
Apparently not. The report mentioned Beijing being displeased with Pakistan's, quote, mild response to Nancy Pelosi's Taiwan visit, and also annoyed about the U.S. ambassador visiting Gwadar itself. So the Iron Brother relationship wasn't looking quite so ironclad.
So Pakistan is caught in this difficult spot between the two giants.
Exactly. And the report suggests that in Pakistan, it's really the military leadership that calls the shots on foreign policy.
Right.
So the theory floated is that the current army chief, Asim Munir, though not named directly in connection with the alleged base deal, might see offering Gwadar to China as a way to, well, fix the relationship, get back in Beijing's good graces, and hopefully secure much-needed economic and military help in return.
And these kinds of sensitive talks would happen behind closed doors, presumably.
Yeah, likely within existing high-level frameworks, like their consultation on strategic defense and security cooperation, sometimes called the 2+2 dialogue.
Okay. And this whole alleged Gwadar base situation, it also plays into that wider regional picture, the whole India-U.S. necklace of diamonds strategy to counter China in the Indian Ocean.
Absolutely. A Chinese military base sitting right there in Gwadar would be a major, major escalation in that context. It really turns up the heat strategically.
Okay, so that's the alleged dynamic with the Gwadar base. Now, what about the third source? The interview with Pakistan's national security advisor. How does that fit in?
Right. This gives us Pakistan's own narrative, or at least the narrative they were projecting at the time of the interview. It's important context for understanding how they see their position and how they want the world to see them.
And the NSA at the time was Dr. Mo Yusuf, though, like you said, the person might be different now, but the message probably has continuity.
Likely reflects a consistent government line, yes. And a big part of that line is this feeling Pakistan has of being, well, unfairly maligned internationally, especially by India, and particularly since 9/11.
What's the argument there?
The argument, as presented by the NSA, is that India jumps to blame Pakistan for basically any terror attack, often without solid proof. Whereas Pakistan, they argue, takes a more responsible route, gathering evidence, building a case. They pointed to a dossier they compiled on alleged Indian activities as proof of their approach.
Okay. Like the Kulbhushan Yadav case.
Exactly. They cite that case at the International Court of Justice as an example of Pakistan following international law. And the NSA went further, suggesting the world is starting to see India itself as a liability because of its own internal issues and its actions in Kashmir.
So Pakistan is trying to flip the narrative, pointing the finger back at India.
That seems to be the strategy. The dossier they mentioned supposedly includes things like receipts for terror financing linked to those FinCEN leaks.
Ah, okay.
Details on attacks, names of people involved, audio clips, video clips, even intelligence about supposed Indian plans against CPEC and in Pakistani-administered Kashmir and Gilgit-Baltistan.
So they're claiming to have concrete evidence of Indian interference and destabilization efforts.
That's the claim. And the NSA stressed this idea of being proactive, being on the front foot with their own story, their own counter-narrative, instead of just reacting defensively to Indian accusations all the time.
And what's the positive vision they're trying to project beyond just countering India?
The vision centers on Pakistan's geoeconomic potential, leveraging its location, pushing for regional connectivity like extending CPEC to Afghanistan, building development partnerships, and working for regional peace.
Trying to position themselves as a hub, a connector.
Exactly. The phrase used was something like a potential melting pot of positive global economic interests, capitalizing on geography.
And how do they contrast this vision with India's alleged actions?
Well, the interview contrasted Pakistan's focus on economics and peace with alleged actions by the Indian NSA, things like getting negative articles written about Pakistan, walking out of meetings, even supposedly discussing military options in a nuclear environment. Pretty stark contrast being drawn there.
So the bottom line from Pakistan's perspective, as presented then, was, world, look at what India's doing, recognize it, and support our positive vision for the region instead.
That's the essence of it.
Okay, so let's try and weave all these threads back together. We started with China blocking this huge port deal.
Right. Driven by strategic worries, concerns about U.S. influence, protecting their trade routes, maybe linked to Belt and Road.
All happening amidst this ongoing U.S.-China tension, with talk of tariffs and rebuilding U.S. shipbuilding.
Then we shifted to Pakistan, caught between these giants grappling with economic woes, and this bombshell allegation of a secret deal to give China a military base at Gwadar.
A move denied by both sides, but one that, if true, would dramatically alter the strategic landscape, potentially driven by Pakistan's complex dance between seeking U.S. support and needing Chinese assistance.
Here, finally, we heard Pakistan's own narrative, trying to counter what they see as Indian negativity, pushing their vision of being a geo-economic hub and asking the world to see things their way.
It really paints a picture of, well, intense geopolitical maneuvering, China making a bold defensive or maybe preemptive move on the ports, Pakistan potentially making a huge strategic gamble with the alleged Gwadar base offer, trying to navigate its own survival and interests between the two superpowers.
And the implications are just massive, aren't they? For global trade routes, Panama Canal, Red Sea, Gwadar for the balance of power in critical regions, and for this overarching U.S.-China rivalry that seems to touch everything now.
It really underscores how connected everything is. A decision about ports in Panama can ripple outwards and intersect with strategic calculations being made in Islamabad and Washington and Beijing.
So maybe the thought to leave our listeners with is this. Considering China's assertiveness over these global ports and this potential alleged major concession from Pakistan and Gwadar, how do you see these moves potentially reshaping that balance of power? How might it affect the global trade dynamics that you personally are watching?
Yeah, that's the key question, isn't it? What are the long-term consequences of these strategic chess moves? And how do the narratives spun by each country influence how these events unfold?
Definitely something to keep thinking about. These aren't just isolated news items. They feel like significant pieces moving on a much larger, constantly shifting global chessboard, worth keeping a very close eye on.
Indeed. It's a powerful reminder of that constant interplay, economics, security, diplomacy, all shaping the world we're living in. Needs constant attention, constant critical thinking.